1995. Walk into any newsstand in America. Pick up Vibe magazine. The cover screams East vs West. Inside, a 10-page spread dissecting every lyric, every interview, every rumor about Tupac Shakur and the notorious B.I.G., framing them not as two artists who'd once been friends, but as generals commanding armies in a coastal war. Next to it, the Source magazine. Another cover, another headline, Hip-Hop Civil War. More articles, more quotes taken out of context. More fuel on a fire that was already burning out of control. And every time one of these magazines hit the stands, they sold out, subscriptions spiked, ad revenue soared. Because conflict sells, drama sells, and two of the biggest names in hip-hop going to war, that sells more than anything. The magazines didn't just report the East Coast-West Coast beef, they created it, amplified it, profited from it, and when Tupac died in September 1996, they ran emotional tributes. When Biggie died 6 months later, they did it again, and then they asked with perfectly crafted concern, how did it come to this? As if they didn't know. As if their covers, their headlines, their editorial choices hadn't turned a resolvable conflict into a war that killed two men. The media didn't pull the triggers, but they loaded the guns. And when the bodies dropped, they sold the story. If you've been following this series, the phone call where Tupac and Biggie tried to make peace, the parallel deaths 6 months apart, this is the missing piece. The reason peace was never an option. The industry that made billions from beef, subscribe. This is the part of the story no one wants to admit. Before 1994, there was no East Coast-West Coast war. There was competition, regional pride, friendly rivalry. New York had been the birthplace of hip-hop, and artists from the East Coast carried that legacy with confidence. The West Coast, led by NWA, Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and later Tupac, had exploded in the early 90s with gangster rap that dominated radio and MTV. But it wasn't a war. Artists from both coasts collaborated, showed up at each other's shows, respected each other's craft. Tupac and Biggie were friends. Tupac had performed in New York. Biggie had respect on the West Coast. The idea that the two coasts were enemies, that didn't exist, until the media decided it should. It started small. Regional awards at the Source Hip Hop Music Awards, Best East Coast Album, Best West Coast Album, a way to celebrate both scenes, but also a way to pit them against each other. Then came the interviews, MTV, BET, radio stations. Every time they sat down with an artist, the questions weren't about the music, they were about the beef. What do you think about what Tupac said? How do you respond to Biggie's lyrics? Are you Team East or Team West? Questions designed not to inform but to provoke, to get a soundbite that could be used in the next news cycle, to create conflict where none existed, or to escalate conflict that could have been resolved quietly. And then came November 30, 1994, the Quad Studios shooting. Tupac was shot 5 times in the lobby of a Manhattan recording studio. He survived, but he came out of that building convinced that Biggie, Puff Daddy and Bad Boy Records had set him up. Whether that was true or not, and there's never been evidence to support it, didn't matter, because Tupac believed it, and the media ran with it. Within days, magazines were publishing articles. Tupac accuses Biggie, East Coast betrayal. Is this the start of a war? They could have approached it with nuance, with investigation, with an attempt to separate fact from paranoia and pain. But nuance doesn't sell magazines, war does. So they framed it as a war, and once that frame was set, everything that followed, every diss track, every interview, every public appearance was filtered through it. Tupac wasn't an artist expressing pain, he was a soldier attacking the enemy. Biggie wasn't defending himself, he was retaliating, and the audience, they were forced to pick a side, because that's what the media told them to do. When you frame a personal conflict as a war, you don't just report the violence, you create it. Let's talk about the magazine covers, because the covers tell the story better than any article could. In 1995 and 1996, Vibe magazine, one of the most influential hip-hop publications in the world, ran multiple covers featuring Tupac and Biggie, not together, not as collaborators, or even as rivals with mutual respect, but as enemies. Split screens, Tupac on one side, Biggie on the other. Headlines like East versus West, the battle for hip-hop's soul. Inside, articles that read like war dispatches. analyzing lyrics as if they were military strategies, quoting artists out of context to make them sound more aggressive than they were, framing every interaction as a skirmish in a larger conflict. And it worked. Those issues flew off shelves. Vibe's circulation numbers during the peak of the Tupac-Biggie beef were the highest in the magazine's history. Advertisers paid premium rates. The editorial staff got raises, and the artists, they got pushed further into corners they couldn't escape. The Source magazine was worse. Founded in 1988 as a voice for hip-hop culture, The Source had credibility. When they said something mattered, people listened. And in the mid-90s, they said the East Coast-West Coast beef mattered. They ran covers. They published think pieces. They gave out regional awards that inherently created competition. And their editorial stance, especially under co-founder David Mays and editor-in-chief Benzino, leaned East Coast, which meant that when they covered the beef, they weren't neutral. They were taking sides. And when a publication takes sides in a conflict, they're not reporting news. They're participants. They're combatants, using their platform as a weapon. And The Source used theirs to amplify tension, validate paranoia, and ensure that every insult, every diss track, every rumor got maximum exposure, not because it was newsworthy, but because it sold magazines. Years later, after Tupac and Biggie were both dead, some of the journalists and editors who'd worked on these stories started admitting regret. Sway Calloway, who'd interviewed both Tupac and Biggie multiple times for MTV, said in a later interview, "We asked the wrong questions. We were so focused on the beef, on getting them to talk about each other, that we missed the opportunity to de-escalate. We could have used our platform to promote peace, but peace doesn't make good TV, so we kept asking about the war." Other editors admitted that they knew that framing every story as East versus West was dangerous, that it was pushing artists into a narrative they couldn't escape. But they did it anyway, because their job wasn't to protect Tupac and Biggie. Their job was to sell magazines, and conflict sold, so they kept publishing, kept running covers, kept writing articles that made the beef seem bigger, more violent, more inevitable than it actually was. And when Tupac died, they ran tributes. Beautiful, emotional, well-written tributes. And then 6 months later, when Biggie died, they did it again. And the irony, the cruel, blood-soaked irony, is that those tribute issues, they sold even better than the beef issues. Because tragedy sells better than conflict. Death sells better than drama. And the media knew it. You can't mourn the people you helped kill and call it journalism. That's just profiting from the corpse. It wasn't just magazines. MTV, BET, radio stations, every media outlet that touched hip-hop in the mid-90s played a role. MTV's coverage of the beef was relentless. Every episode of Yo MTV Raps, every news segment, every interview, it was always framed around the conflict. Tupac says this, Biggie responds, "What's next?" They treated it like a sports rivalry, like it was entertainment, and maybe to them it was. But to the artists, it was their lives, their reputations, and every time MTV aired another segment hyping the beef, it became harder for Tupac and Biggie to de-escalate, because the world was watching, and the world expected a fight. The media had built the cage, and now the artists were trapped inside it. BET did the same. Their news coverage leaned into the drama. Their award shows became battlegrounds. Who would show up? Who would boycott? Who would say what on stage? And radio stations, they played the diss tracks on loop. Hit 'Em Up by Tupac, a song so vicious, so personal, that even people who loved Tupac admitted it crossed lines, was played dozens of times a day on West Coast stations. Biggie's responses, veiled or explicit, got the same treatment on East Coast stations, and DJs would hype it. Coming up next, the hottest beef in hip-hop, as if it was a good thing, as if encouraging young black men to threaten each other publicly was content worth celebrating. And the audience, the fans, the kids buying the albums and the magazines, they absorbed it. They picked sides. East Coast kids wore Biggie shirts, West Coast kids repped Tupac. And the media told them that's how it should be. That loyalty meant choosing a side. That being a fan meant participating in the war. Here's the thing people forget. Tupac and Biggie tried to stop it. That phone call in 1995, the one we covered in an earlier video, where Tupac called Biggie from prison and they talked about ending the beef, that could have been the story. Tupac and Biggie make peace. Imagine if Vibe or The Source had run that as a cover. Imagine if MTV had aired an interview where both artists sat down together and said, "This is over, we're moving forward." The media had the power to de-escalate, to frame peace as strength instead of weakness, to celebrate resolution instead of conflict. But they didn't, because a resolved beef is a dead story, and dead stories don't sell. So when Tupac and Biggie tried to make peace, the media ignored it. And when they couldn't ignore it, they downplayed it. And when they couldn't downplay it, they questioned it. Is the peace real, or is this just a publicity stunt? Always skeptical of resolution, always ready to stoke the fire again, because the fire was profitable, and the media had too much invested in keeping it burning. When your business model depends on conflict, peace becomes a threat. There's a darker layer here. The media wasn't just reporting on the beef. They were being used by the labels. Death Row Records and Bad Boy Records both understood that beef sold albums. Controversy generated press, and press generated sales. So they fed the media. Suge Knight would give interviews where he'd take shots at Bad Boy. Puff Daddy would respond in his own interviews. Both labels knew that every article, every cover, every news segment about the beef was free advertising. And the media, they were happy to oblige, because it was symbiotic. The labels got publicity, the media got content, and the artists, they were the product, used by both sides. Death Row used Tupac to build their brand as the aggressive, unapologetic West Coast powerhouse. Bad Boy used Biggie as the cool, polished East Coast counterpoint. And the media used both of them to sell magazines and ad space. It was a machine, and Tupac and Biggie were the fuel. And when the machine finally consumed them, when they both died within 6 months of each other, the labels and the media acted shocked, mourned publicly, promised to do better, and then went right back to business, because the machine didn't stop when the artists died. It just found new fuel. The industry doesn't mourn artists. It monetizes their deaths. In the years after Tupac and Biggie's deaths, some people in the media started speaking out. Not many, but enough to paint a picture of how deeply the guilt ran. Sway Calloway, who'd built a career interviewing hip-hop artists, admitted in a 2010 interview that he regretted the way he'd framed questions during the beef era. He said he'd asked Tupac and Biggie questions designed to get inflammatory answers, that he'd pushed them to talk about each other when they clearly wanted to talk about their music. And he said the reason was simple. His producers told him that's what the audience wanted, that ratings went up when there was conflict. And if he didn't deliver conflict, someone else would. So he did, and he's carried that guilt for decades. Other journalists echoed similar sentiments. Writers who'd covered the beef for Vibe, The Source, XXL, they started admitting, in retrospectives and podcasts and anniversary pieces, that they'd known at the time that what they were doing was dangerous, that framing every story as East versus West was irresponsible, but they justified it to themselves. We're just reporting what's happening. The beef is real. We didn't create it. If we don't cover it, someone else will. All the rationalizations people use when they know they're complicit in something harmful but don't want to admit it. And maybe some of them genuinely believed they were just doing their jobs. But intent doesn't erase impact. And the impact was clear. 2 men are dead, and the media helped kill them. There's a particular magazine cover from 1996 that haunts people who worked in hip-hop media during that era. It's a Vibe cover, published in June, 3 months before Tupac was shot. The headline, "Who's Next?" Inside, an article speculating about which artists were most at risk of violence. Tupac and Biggie were both mentioned. The article framed it as inevitability. With tensions this high, it's not a question of if something happens, but when. And the editors who worked on that issue later said they remembered feeling uneasy about it, about framing violence as inevitable instead of preventable, but they published it anyway because it was provocative, and provocation sold. And 3 months later, Tupac was shot, and 6 months after that, Biggie was shot. And that cover, it became evidence, not of foresight, but of how the media normalized violence, made it seem like the logical endpoint of the narrative they'd been building. And when the deaths actually happened, they got to act surprised, got to run tributes, got to ask how did it come to this, when they'd spent 2 years telling everyone exactly how it would come to this. You don't get to predict the tragedy and then pretend you didn't help cause it. Here's what the media won't admit. They had options. At every stage of the Tupac-Biggie beef, they had choices. When Tupac accused Biggie of setting him up after Quad Studios, the media could have investigated, could have asked where's the evidence, what actually happened that night. Instead, they ran headlines, Tupac blames Biggie, no context, no nuance, just accusation treated as fact. When Tupac signed with Death Row and started recording diss tracks, the media could have framed it as an artist in pain, lashing out from trauma and paranoia. Instead, they framed it as a declaration of war. When Biggie responded, or when his songs were interpreted as responses, the media could have said, "This is two men hurting each other with words. Let's not make it bigger than it is." Instead, they amplified every lyric, every interview, every rumor, until the beef wasn't just between Tupac and Biggie. It was between coasts, regions, millions of fans who'd never met either artist but felt compelled to pick a side because the media told them that's what being a fan meant. And when Tupac and Biggie tried to de-escalate, and they did try, the media could have supported it, could have run stories about resolution, about maturity, about two artists choosing peace over ego, but they didn't, because peace doesn't generate clicks, peace doesn't spike circulation numbers, peace doesn't get advertisers excited, so the media ignored the peace attempts and focused on the conflict, because conflict was their business model, and business was good, until September 1996, when Tupac was shot, and suddenly business became a body count, and the media had to decide, do we take responsibility for the role we played, or do we keep pretending we were just observers? Most chose the latter, ran tributes, mourned publicly, and then, when the shock wore off, went back to covering the next beef, the next conflict, the next profitable war, because the machine doesn't stop, it just resets. Afeni Shakur, Tupac's mother, gave an interview in 2003 where she was asked about the media's role in her son's death, and she said something that cut through all the rationalizations and justifications. They treated my son like a character in a story they were writing, not like a human being with a mother who loved him. They turned his pain into entertainment, and when he died, they acted like they cared. But if they'd cared, they would have stopped writing the story that got him killed. That quote didn't get much coverage because it was too uncomfortable, too direct. It didn't allow the media to hide behind "we were just doing our jobs" or "we didn't create the beef, we just reported it." It called them what they were, complicit. And complicity is a hard thing to admit, especially when you profited from it, especially when you're still profiting from it. Because here's the reality. Vibe, The Source, XXL, they're still here, still running retrospectives, still publishing anniversary issues, 25 years since Tupac's death, remembering Biggie, still making money off the names of two men they helped destroy, and calling it tribute, calling it remembrance, when really, it's just the same business model, the same exploitation, just repackaged for a new generation. You can't build your career on someone's tragedy and then claim you're honoring their memory. That's just profiting from the grave. The East Coast-West Coast beef wasn't inevitable. It was constructed by labels who saw profit in conflict, by media who saw content in drama, and by a culture that rewards beef over resolution. Tupac and Biggie didn't have to die. They tried to make peace. They made that phone call. They talked about moving past the bullshit. But the system wouldn't let them, because the system needed them at war, needed them making diss tracks, needed them giving inflammatory interviews, needed them as symbols of a conflict that sold albums, magazines, and ad space. And when the conflict turned deadly, when Tupac was shot in September and Biggie was shot in March, the system mourned, publicly, performatively, and then kept going. Because the artists were replaceable, the content was not. And 27 years later, we're still consuming that content, still watching documentaries, still reading articles, still debating who was right and who was wrong, still participating in the same system that killed them. Because the media trained us well, trained us to see conflict as entertainment, to see beef as content, to see tragedy as a story worth consuming. And as long as we keep consuming, the machine keeps running, and the next Tupac and Biggie are already being fed into it. The media didn't pull the triggers, but they made the bullets, and they're still selling them. So here's the question no one wants to answer. Could the media have stopped it? If Vibe, The Source, MTV, BET, and every radio station in America had made a collective decision in 1995 to stop covering the beef, to refuse to publish inflammatory headlines, to decline interviews that only asked about conflict, to focus on the music instead of the war, could Tupac and Biggie have survived? The honest answer is maybe, maybe not, because the beef had roots deeper than media coverage. There was real pain, real paranoia, real street politics and label manipulation, but the media amplified all of it, took a conflict that could have stayed contained and broadcast it to millions, made it a cultural event, a national narrative, and in doing so, made it impossible for Tupac and Biggie to escape. Because once you're a symbol, once you're a character in a story, the world is watching. You can't just be a person anymore. You have to play the role, or risk being seen as weak, as a sellout, as someone who backed down. And in hip-hop culture, especially in the 90s, backing down was unforgivable. So Tupac and Biggie kept playing their roles, kept giving the media what the media wanted, until the roles consumed them. But let's be clear about one thing. The media knew what they were doing. They weren't naive. They weren't just reporting the news. They were making editorial choices. Choices about what to cover, how to frame it, what headlines to run, what questions to ask. And every one of those choices prioritized profit over responsibility, content over consequence, the story over the human beings living it. And when those human beings died, the media didn't stop. They pivoted from covering the beef to covering the deaths, from selling conflict to selling tragedy, from East versus West to hip-hop's greatest loss. Same business model, different angle, same profit motive, different product. And the audience, the fans, the readers, the viewers, we bought it. We consumed the beef, we consumed the deaths, and now we're consuming the retrospectives, because the media trained us to see Tupac and Biggie as content, not as people. And content doesn't die, it just gets repurposed. In 2023, Vibe magazine ran a cover, Tupac 27 years later. Inside, articles about his influence, his music, his legacy, written with reverence, with respect, as if the magazine that had spent 1995-1996 stoking the flames of his beef with Biggie was now the guardian of his memory. And maybe that's the final insult, that the institutions that helped kill him get to control how he's remembered, get to profit from his name in perpetuity, get to rewrite their own history, conveniently forgetting the covers that said East versus West, the articles that treated his pain like entertainment, the questions that pushed him further into a corner he couldn't escape, and acting like they were always on his side, always respected him, always wanted the best for him, when the truth is simpler and uglier. They wanted what he could give them: sales, clicks, ratings. And when he couldn't give them anymore, when he was dead, they moved on to the next artist, the next beef, the next profitable conflict. Because that's what the media does. It consumes, and it doesn't stop consuming. Just because the body's cold, the media doesn't memorialize artists. It monetizes their corpses and calls it legacy. On September 7, 1996, Tupac Shakur was shot in Las Vegas. On March 9, 1997, the notorious B.I.G. was shot in Los Angeles. Both murders remain unsolved. Both cases are cold, and the media that spent 2 years turning their personal conflict into a cultural war, they're still here, still publishing, still running covers with their names, still acting like they were just observers when they were architects. They built the war, fed the artists into it, and when the inevitable happened, when violence became the endpoint of the narrative they'd constructed, they mourned, publicly, performatively, and then they kept going, because the machine doesn't stop. It just finds new fuel, new artists, new beefs, new conflicts to amplify and monetize. And we, the audience, keep feeding it, because the media taught us to see beef as entertainment, to see conflict as content, to see tragedy as a story worth consuming. And as long as we're watching, reading, clicking, they'll keep producing, keep profiting, keep pretending they care about the culture when really they just care about the revenue. Tupac and Biggie tried to make peace. They made that phone call in 1995. They talked about ending it. But peace wasn't an option the media would allow, because peace doesn't sell, and in an industry built on profit, anything that doesn't sell gets buried, including the truth, including accountability, including the lives of two men who deserved better than to be turned into content, into symbols, into casualties of a war the media manufactured and then monetized. That's the legacy, not the music, not the art, but the fact that the institutions that helped kill them are still here, still profiting, still telling the story, and still refusing to admit their role in how it ended. They didn't pull the triggers, but they loaded the guns, and they sold the bullets, and they're still cashing the checks. Did the media kill Tupac and Biggie, or were they just doing their jobs? Drop your take below.